In the dead of night, as the world around him slept, James Carter, a seasoned mechanic, was working late at a local auto repair shop. He was used to these hours, long, grueling shifts that allowed him to take care of his family and keep the garage running smoothly. But tonight was different. Tonight, the hum of the engine, the clank of tools on metal, and the quiet of the empty streets were interrupted by a sound that would change his life forever. A scream, a gunshot, then the unmistakable silence that followed. James froze, wrench in hand, heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, he rushed toward the sound, his instincts telling him to help. What he found would be something no one could have prepared him for. In the alley behind the shop, under the flickering streetlight, lay a body, blood pooling around the lifeless form of a man he recognized. Mayor Thomas Reynolds, the man who ran the town, was dead. His eyes stared into the night, unblinking, and his lips were frozen in a final, haunting expression. The air was thick with tension, and James stood there, unsure of what to do next. But then, before he could react, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Panic swept over him. He knew that, as a black man in this town, he'd already been under the scrutiny of the police for years, always treated with suspicion, always an outsider, no matter how hard he worked to stay out of trouble. And now, with the mayor's body lying just yards away, everything he had worked for, every moment of peace, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Within minutes, the police arrived, and as the officers quickly surrounded the scene, James found himself shoved against a cold brick wall, his hands cuffed behind his back. The words came at him like daggers, accusations and questions, all pointing to one thing: he was the killer. The very man who had seen the crime unfold, the only witness, was now the prime suspect. But James knew something the police didn't. This wasn't just a random murder. There was something bigger at play. A web of corruption had been spun around this town for years, with Mayor Reynolds at its heart. James had seen the signs, the shady deals, the under-the-table exchanges, but he never thought they'd lead to something like this. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the mayor's death was no accident, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. As the days went by, the town seemed to turn against him. The media painted him as the villain, a man with a past, with connections that made people uncomfortable. The mayor's murder quickly became a case of cover-up, with corrupt officials trying to manipulate the story. And the harder James fought to prove his innocence, the more they worked to silence him. His car repair shop, once a place of pride, became a target. His customers stopped showing up, whispers followed him wherever he went, and even his closest friends began to question his involvement. James had gone from a respected mechanic to a man with no future, nothing to lose. But James wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. Not when the truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. With every passing day, he uncovered more, a trail of corruption that led to people in power, including those who had once called him a friend. The walls were closing in, but James was determined to fight back. He couldn't let the mayor's death go unpunished. Not when he knew the town was being run by a criminal syndicate, controlled by the very men who held all the power. The more he dug, the more dangerous things became. He was being watched, followed, and threatened, but none of it stopped him. His resolve only grew stronger. He knew that to clear his name, to reveal the truth, he would have to confront the very people who had put him in this position. But would anyone believe him? Or had the town already made up its mind? James had no choice but to continue, even as the danger grew closer. Every step forward felt like a step into the unknown, where trust was scarce and betrayal was around every corner. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to him was pulling the strings, trying to ensure that the truth would never see the light of day. Now, the story is far from over. The man who was once just a mechanic is now entangled in a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where nothing is as it seems, and every ally could be an enemy. As he gets closer to the truth, James realizes the stakes have never been higher. His freedom, his life, and the future of the entire town depend on him uncovering a conspiracy that could bring down the corrupt powers that have ruled for far too long. But in the end, the question remains, who can he trust, and who is just waiting for the perfect moment to betray him? James couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his old, squeaky mattress, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mayor's face, cold, lifeless, and staring back at him. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from, but no matter how many times he blinked, the reality remained. The mayor was dead, and James was the one they were pointing to as the killer. The whole town had flipped on him so quickly. Just a few days ago, he was a mechanic known for fixing engines and keeping cars running smoothly. People trusted him, respected him, and maybe even considered him a quiet pillar of the community. Now, it was as if that trust had evaporated overnight. The same people who used to nod at him when they saw him on the street now turned their heads away, as though they knew something he didn't. The whispers, the stares, the accusations, it all felt suffocating. But what hurt the most wasn't the judgment of the town. It was the betrayal of the people who had once been his friends. Tommy, his old high school buddy, had been one of the first to turn on him. James had known Tommy since they were kids, both of them getting into trouble in the same neighborhood, both of them learning how to fix engines and cars from their fathers. They had shared beers and stories, celebrated victories, and helped each other when times got tough. But now, Tommy was nowhere to be found. He hadn't answered James' calls, and when James showed up at his door, Tommy wasn't there, and his wife wouldn't even look him in the eye. That's when James realized something. Tommy was involved in this. Maybe not directly in the murder, but somehow tied up in the web of lies surrounding it. Something didn't sit right with the way Tommy had disappeared, and that feeling grew stronger every day. The more James thought about it, the more everything pointed back to the mayor. Mayor Reynolds had always been a divisive figure, but the man had been untouchable. The kind of power he wielded, the deals he had under the table, the backroom conversations that never saw the light of day. It was all too much for one person to hold without someone getting hurt. James had known for years that something shady was going on in this town. He had overheard things in the shop, seen too many people come and go, people who seemed to have more money than they knew what to do with. But he kept his head down, stayed out of trouble. That was how he survived, by being invisible. But now the lines between the good guys and the bad guys had blurred. He couldn't stay invisible anymore, not when his freedom was on the line. Not when the whole town seemed to be part of the conspiracy. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them by sitting around waiting for someone to clear his name. James decided to start digging. The first place he went was the police station. It was a risk, but he knew he had to start somewhere. If he could get his hands on some records, maybe he could piece things together. Maybe he could find a trail that would lead him to the truth. But when he walked through the door, something didn't feel right. The receptionist, a woman named Linda, gave him a cold stare. She'd always been friendly before, but now there was a chill in the air. "You here to turn yourself in, Carter?" she asked with a tight smile, her voice lacking any warmth. "No," James replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm just looking for some records, something to help me with my defense. I need to clear my name." Linda's eyes narrowed. "You sure that's what you want? You might not like what you find." That warning stung. He wasn't sure if she was trying to intimidate him or if she was genuinely concerned, but he wasn't going to back down. "I need to see what you've got," he said, his voice firm. "I'll take anything you can give me." She hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the back. "You're on your own then. Don't say I didn't warn you." James made his way to the records room. The walls seemed to close in on him with each step. It was a small, windowless room filled with boxes stacked high, each one containing a file from some case long forgotten. He shuffled through the papers, his hands moving with a purpose as he searched for anything that might connect the mayor to anything shady. He pulled out old case files, police reports, anything that might give him some insight. But there was nothing. No smoking gun, Just paperwork, forms, and more paperwork. His frustration mounted. What was he missing? Why couldn't he find anything? It was then that he saw it, a small, dusty envelope tucked away in the back of a drawer, almost as if someone had hidden it on purpose. His heart skipped a beat. There was something inside it, something different. He ripped it open quickly, the paper crinkling as he unfolded it. Inside was a single photograph. It was blurry, taken in the middle of a crowded room, but the faces were clear enough. In the center was Maya Reynolds, standing next to several men James didn't recognize. But one face stood out, Tommy. Tommy, his old friend, was right there, shaking hands with the mayor. The look on his face was one of absolute respect, almost reverence. And behind them, in the shadows, were two men James knew all too well, Jimmy O'Malley and Vince the Knife Taurus, local criminals who had always skirted the law without ever getting caught. A chill ran down James' spine. He knew the reputation of O'Malley and Torres. Both of them were known for working with the mayor, for being involved in shady deals, and for making sure anyone who got in their way disappeared without a trace. Tommy had been in the thick of it, and James had no idea. This photo was his first real lead, but it raised more questions than answers. Why hadn't Tommy told him about this? What was he really involved in? And why was the mayor so connected to men like O'Malley and Torres? As James slipped the photograph into his jacket pocket, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He wasn't alone. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the empty hallway and the distant sound of voices outside. But that nagging feeling, the one that told him someone was watching him, stayed with him as he left the police station, slipping into the shadows of the night. He wasn't safe anymore. They knew he was getting closer to something. Someone was trying to stop him, and he didn't know who. But he had to keep going. The truth was out there, and he was getting closer to it with every step. James couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. It wasn't just paranoia. He could feel eyes on him, even when he was walking down the empty streets. The unease had settled into his bones, gnawing at him. He'd been careful not to make any rash moves, but with the photograph now safely tucked in his jacket pocket, things were starting to unravel in ways he couldn't have imagined. That night, as he walked back to his car parked in the alley behind the shop, he thought about what he'd uncovered. Tommy, standing beside the mayor in that photo, was a revelation. A man who had once been his brother in everything but blood, now implicated in something far darker than James had ever realized. Tommy had always been ambitious, always looking for ways to get ahead, but James never thought he'd go this far. That photograph painted him as someone far more dangerous than the mechanic who had once helped him fix an engine. James tried to process it, but the more he thought about it, the more complicated everything became. Tommy had never said a word about the mayor's dealings with men like O'Malley and Torres, yet here they were, smiling in a photo that was now evidence in a murder investigation. It didn't add up. What was Tommy's real role in all of this? Was he just a pawn, or had he been a player all along? The next morning, James set out to find Tommy. His usual routine at the shop seemed irrelevant now. There was no point in fixing cars or pretending everything was normal. His life had been turned upside down, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. The sooner he found Tommy, the sooner he could piece together the last part of the puzzle. But he had a sinking feeling that finding Tommy wouldn't be as simple as knocking on his door. As he made his way through the neighborhood, he couldn't help but notice how much quieter everything felt. The familiar faces were gone, the usual sounds of children playing or neighbors chatting in front yards replaced by a stifling silence. It felt like everyone knew something he didn't, and they were all too afraid to speak up. The town had always been small, its rhythm predictable. But now, every corner seemed to hold a secret. Every face in the crowd was a stranger. James stopped by Tommy's house, but the place was empty. There were no signs of life, no lights on, no cars in the driveway. He knocked, but there was no answer. It was as if Tommy had vanished without a trace. That only made the knot in James' stomach tighten. What was Tommy running from? He left a note on the front door, something simple. Asterisk, I know what you're involved in, and I need answers. Call me. Asterisk, he didn't expect a response, but he couldn't leave without doing something. That photograph was too important to ignore, and Tommy was the key to everything. Back at the shop, James spent the rest of the day going over his options. He could go to the police, tell them what he'd found, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure he could trust them anymore. The way they had immediately pinned the mayor's death on him, the way they had treated him like a suspect before even considering him a witness, it was clear that they weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in closing the case quickly, pinning it on whoever was easiest, and that meant him. He wasn't ready to give up just yet, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the corruption went deeper than he had imagined. The mayor's ties to O'Malley and Torres were just the beginning. James had heard rumors for years about illegal activities in the town, drug deals, money laundering, and worse, but he'd never been directly involved. Now, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He was at the center of something much bigger than he had realized. The mayor's death wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of a system designed to protect the powerful and silence anyone who threatened it. James had always believed that the small town he grew up in had some good in it, that the people here had a sense of community, a sense of right and wrong. But now he was starting to see the cracks in that facade. No one could be trusted, not even the ones he had called friends. Tommy's betrayal stung, but it wasn't the only one. He had a gut feeling that there were others, people close to him who had been hiding their true colors all along. The phone call came late in the evening. James had been sitting in his shop, the dim light from the overhead bulbs casting long shadows on the walls, when his cell buzzed on the counter. He grabbed it quickly, half expecting it to be another officer asking questions he didn't have answers to. But the number on the screen wasn't a police contact, it was an unknown number. James Carter, a voice on the other end said. It was a man's voice, low and measured. You've been asking questions, digging into things that don't concern you. You need to stop. James' heart raced. It was a warning, but from who? The voice was unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just a random threat. It was a message from someone who knew what he had uncovered. What do you want? James asked, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline in his veins. You don't want to know, the voice replied, a hint of menace creeping through the calm. You keep poking around, and you're going to regret it. You've already got the attention of people who are far more dangerous than you realize. Before James could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of the conversation sinking in. This wasn't just some random warning. It was a reminder of how deep the corruption ran, and how much power the people behind it had. James knew he couldn't back down now, but the stakes had just been raised. Whoever was behind the mayor's murder wasn't going to let him walk away with the truth. He was being watched, threatened, and pushed into a corner. The question was, how much longer could he keep playing this dangerous game before the walls closed in completely? As the night drew on, James found himself thinking about the town's history, about the families and the businesses that had built it up over the years. It wasn't just about the mayor or Tommy or the criminal underworld. It was about the people who had been crushed under the weight of a system that had never been designed to protect them. James had spent his whole life fixing things, engines, cars, machines, but now he realized that what needed fixing was something far bigger than he ever expected. And the more he uncovered, the more he knew that the town's future, his own life, and even the lives of those around him depended on whether or not he could find the truth before it was buried forever. The days started to blend together, each one darker than the last. James couldn't tell where the hours went anymore, his mind consumed with the hunt for answers. The weight of the photo he'd found, Tommy with the mayor and the criminals, seemed to grow heavier every time he thought about it. But every lead he followed, every person he approached, only seemed to lead to more questions, more uncertainty. It was like walking through a maze, where the walls closed in tighter the longer he tried to find the exit. His phone rang again that night, the harsh ring slicing through the quiet of the shop. This time, the number was familiar. Tommy. James hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest. Was it a trap? Had Tommy finally come to his senses? Or was this a calculated move to draw him into something worse? He stared at the screen for a moment longer, then answered. "Tommy," James said, his voice thick with disbelief. There was a long pause on the other end before Tommy's voice finally came through, low and strained. "James, I'm in trouble. I didn't want this for you. But you have to understand, I had no choice." Had no choice? James felt his stomach twist. "What the hell are you talking about? You've been lying to me, Tommy. You've been involved in all this. Everything with Reynolds, O'Malley, Torres. You don't get to play the victim now." Tommy sighed, the sound heavy with regret. I know it looks bad, but I didn't kill him, James. I didn't, but they'll make it look like I did. They're using me. You have no idea what you're dealing with. O'Malley and Torres, they're not just criminals. They've got people in high places. People who'll do anything to cover their tracks." James clenched his fists, his mind racing. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come clean? You were my friend." "I couldn't," Tommy whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought I could keep it all under control, but I was wrong. Reynolds is going to blow it all wide open, you understand. He was going to take down everything, the whole operation. That's why they killed him." James' blood ran cold. "Wait, you're telling me Reynolds was planning to expose all this, and now he's dead?" Tommy didn't answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur. "You have no idea how deep this goes, James. It's bigger than you think. The mayor was just a piece. But now I don't know how much longer I can keep this under wraps. You're in danger, man. You and your family, get out of here. It's not safe." "Where are you?" James demanded, but before Tommy could respond, the call was abruptly cut off. James stared at the phone, his mind racing. He had to find Tommy. He had to get answers before whatever was out there found him first, but something was off. The more he thought about it, the more everything felt like a trap. Tommy's words were heavy with fear, but he had just warned James to run, to leave the town behind. James couldn't walk away from this. Not now. He had come too far, uncovered too much. Something told him that Tommy wasn't just trying to protect him. He was trying to protect himself, and that made James more determined than ever to find him. James knew he couldn't trust anyone in the town anymore. He couldn't go to the police. They were part of the problem. He couldn't trust his old friends, who had already chosen their sides. He had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. As the night deepened, James set out again. He didn't know where to look, but he knew he had to find Tommy. The tension in the air felt suffocating, every footstep echoing louder than the last. His car seemed like the only thing standing between him and complete isolation. Every corner he turned felt like he was being watched, followed, but he had no choice. The photo he had found, the one of Tommy, the mayor, and the criminals, kept flashing in his mind. What had Tommy been involved in? How much did he really know? And why had he been so afraid to come forward? James was about to find out. He finally made his way to the outskirts of town, to the old warehouse district. It was a place he'd always avoided. Too many rumors, too many shady deals going on behind closed doors. It was the kind of place where people disappeared. But now, it was the only place that made sense. He had to find Tommy. As he parked his car in the shadows, a dark figure emerged from between two rusted buildings. James' heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Tommy, but it was someone who looked all too familiar, Jimmy O'Malley. The man's hulking figure loomed in the dim light, his eyes locking onto James with an eerie calm. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, O'Malley took a slow step forward, his hand resting casually on the handle of a gun tucked into his waistband. "I was wondering when you'd show up," O'Malley said, his voice laced with amusement. "You've been asking too many questions, James. You've been digging where you should." James' pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "I'm not afraid of you, O'Malley. I'm not afraid of anyone who's part of this mess. You killed the mayor. You think I'm just going to let you get away with it?" O'Malley chuckled, the sound cold and menacing. "You don't even know the half of it, kid. You're in way over your head. All these little games you're playing, all this digging, it's going to get you killed. You really think you can take down someone like Reynolds people? You're nothing but a mechanic. A pawn in a game you don't understand." The words hung in the air like a challenge. James clenched his fists, his mind racing. O'Malley was playing with him, testing him, but he knew better than to back down now. If he was going to get to the truth, he had to face whatever this man, and whoever else was involved, had to throw at him. "You think this is over? You think you can control everything?" James shot back. "The mayor's dead. You've got blood on your hands. And I'm not going anywhere until I make sure you pay for what you did." O'Malley's grin faded, replaced by something colder. "You don't understand, James. There's no paying for this. No one's getting out alive. You've already made your choice. Now you have to live with it." Suddenly, O'Malley's hand went to his gun, but before he could pull it out, a sharp crack echoed in the night, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. O'Malley froze, his expression shifting from confident to wary. Someone else was here, and James had no idea who. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with danger, like a storm about to break. James was no longer just a witness to a murder. He was in the eye of the storm. The footsteps grew louder, and for a split second, James thought he might finally get some help. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the crowbar he always kept in his car. But what he saw next sent a chill down his spine, freezing him in place. Emerging from the shadows wasn't another enemy, nor a mysterious ally. It was someone he knew all too well. "Tommy," James gasped, his voice barely a whisper, disbelief creeping in. Tommy stood there, a gun in his hand, but it wasn't pointed at O'Malley. No, it was aimed straight at James. "Tommy, what the hell are you doing?" James took a step back, his heart thumping in his chest, his mind spun, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this a betrayal? Was this the final piece of the puzzle falling into place, confirming everything he'd feared about Tommy? Tommy's eyes were hollow, his face gaunt as if he hadn't slept in days. Sweat clung to his forehead despite the cold night air. He looked like a man on the edge, someone who had been pushed to a breaking point. But the gun in his hand told a different story. "James, you don't understand," Tommy said, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "You don't know what they've done to me, what I've been forced to do. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I didn't have a choice. I had to survive." James took another cautious step back. The barrel of the gun wavered in Tommy's grip, but there was a resolve in his eyes that James had never seen before. "You think I'm the one who's been lying to you. You're the one who's been played, man. All of this, it's bigger than you can imagine. It was never just about the mayor. It's about control, power, and the people who hold it don't care who they crush along the way." James was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. He'd trusted Tommy. They had been through too much together, shared too many late nights talking about their dreams, their fears. And now here he was, a stranger, someone pointing a gun at him as if he was just another problem to be dealt with. But the worst part, James wasn't sure if Tommy was right. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he could feel the tension building, the stakes rising with every passing second. His gut told him that there was something else going on, something darker, something that would change everything. "Tommy, please," James said, trying to keep his voice calm. "What are you talking about? I'm not your enemy. Whatever you're tangled in, we can fix this. Just put the gun down. We'll figure it out together." For a moment, Tommy's eyes flickered with uncertainty. But then, without warning, the sound of another car engine rumbled in the distance. Both of them froze, listening intently. The faint glow of headlights pierced the darkness. It was too late to run now. O'Malley took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "Looks like the party's just getting started, huh, James?" He chuckled darkly. "Did you really think Tommy was going to save you? Did you think you could walk away from this mess unscathed? There's no escaping now, not for any of us. The car stopped a few yards away, and James instinctively tensed. He didn't know who was in the car, but the timing of it all felt like a trap. And judging by the way Tommy's hand tightened around the grip of the gun, James knew there was no escaping this moment. The door to the car opened with a creak. A tall, imposing figure stepped out, and as the headlights caught his face, James' stomach dropped. It was the last person he expected to see. Sheriff Daniels. The sheriff. The man who had been overseeing the investigation into the mayor's murder. The man who had promised to bring justice. And now he was standing right there, a smile creeping up his face as he took in the scene. His eyes flickered between O'Malley and Tommy before settling on James. "Didn't I warn you, James?" Daniels said, his voice slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You really should have left this alone. Now look at where you are, caught in the middle of a game you can't even comprehend." James' mind spun as the truth began to crash into him. Daniels wasn't just some by-the-book lawman. He was a part of this. He was tied to O'Malley and Torres, to the criminals running this town. He had been in on it all along, playing both sides, pretending to seek justice while protecting the very people responsible for the mayor's death. The realization hit hard. Sheriff Daniels was no more a protector of the town than O'Malley. He was part of the same corrupt system, the same web of lies that had entangled James in this nightmare. "Tommy," James started, his voice shaking. "You knew, didn't you? You knew he was part of this." Tommy didn't answer, his gaze shifting between the sheriff and James. The air between them grew heavier, thicker with tension. The truth was out now, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a trap closing in from all sides. Daniels stepped forward, his presence overpowering. "It's over, James. You've seen too much. And now you're going to pay the price for your curiosity." James wanted to shout, to demand answers, but his throat tightened as the weight of everything came crushing down. There was no escape, no way out. He was surrounded, caught in a dangerous game with no rules. His body tensed, ready for the worst, but even as the sheriff stepped closer, something shifted in the air. A loud bang erupted in the distance, the sound of gunfire cutting through the night. O'Malley's face twisted in confusion, and even Tommy's grip on the gun faltered for a second. Before anyone could react, the sound of heavy boots pounding the ground echoed from all directions. More people were coming. Reinforcements, maybe your enemies. James didn't know. But one thing was certain, whatever happened next would change everything. The sound of boots grew louder, and the tension in the air seemed to crackle with electric urgency. James barely had time to process what was happening when, out of nowhere, a shadow lunged from behind the old warehouse, crashing into Sheriff Daniels with a force that knocked him to the ground. It all happened too fast to fully comprehend, shouting, struggling, a flash of movement as two more figures emerged, guns drawn, and chaos erupted in the darkness. For a moment, James could only watch in stunned silence as the sheriff grappled with his attacker, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. The sound of fists hitting flesh echoed in the cold night air. Tommy stood frozen, the gun still in his hands, as if unsure which side to fight for. But then, in a blur of motion, James saw something that made his heart stop. One of the figures who had rushed to Daniel's aid pulled back his hood, revealing a face James knew all too well. It was Detective Laura Mitchell. She was the last person James expected to see. She'd been the only officer who'd ever seemed to show any real interest in solving the mayor's murder, until she suddenly disappeared from the investigation. At the time, he'd thought it was just a coincidence, but now, seeing her in the midst of this chaos, everything clicked. She wasn't just part of the system, she was fighting to bring it down. With a sharp move, Laura yanked Sheriff Daniels off his feet, slamming him against the side of the car. Her eyes were cold, determined. "Get back, James," she shouted, not bothering to explain. "I'm not letting them bury this." O'Malley turned, his gun drawn in an instant, But before he could fire, a second shot rang out, forcing him to stumble backward, clutching his shoulder. The second figure, the one who had been hidden in the shadows, had fired, and O'Malley was down. James, still reeling from the shock, blinked as the situation unfolded before him. Laura, her face grim but resolute, turned to Tommy. "Put the gun down. We're ending this tonight." Tommy hesitated, the weapon shaking in his hands. He looked at James, then back at the chaos around him, his face a mixture of fear and guilt. Before Tommy could finish, a new voice interrupted them, low and dangerous. "Is that so?" James spun around, and his blood ran cold when he saw who had just stepped into the scene. It was Mayor Reynolds' replacement, Mayor Harris, the man who had seemed so calm and composed in public. But now, in the dim light, his eyes were wild, frantic with anger, and in his hand was the unmistakable glint of a silver revolver. "Thought you could take me down, huh?" Mayor Harris sneered, stepping forward with measured steps, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You don't know who you're dealing with, James. None of you do. This town is mine, and anyone who tries to take it from me, well, you've seen what happens." James' mind raced, piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. Harris had been the one pulling the strings from the very beginning. He had orchestrated the mayor's murder, used O'Malley and Torres's pawns, and played Tommy to do his bidding. The corruption in this town ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and Harris had been behind it all. "You're the one who killed Reynolds, aren't you?" James shouted, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "You've been running this whole thing from the start." Harris' lips curled into a mocking smile. "Of course I did. You think it was some random street thug?" "No, I had bigger plans. Reynolds was weak. He didn't have the guts to keep things under control like I do. He was a liability. But now I've got everything in place." "You're going to prison for this," Laura said, her voice calm but full of conviction. But Harris just laughed, a low, cruel sound. "You really think that's going to happen? You think the system is going to bring me down? I own this town, Laura. I control it. And once you're all gone, there's no one left to stop me. No one." Before anyone could react, Harris raised the gun, aiming directly at Laura. Time seemed to freeze. But then, with a sudden movement, Tommy lunged forward. In one fluid motion, he knocked the gun out of Harris' hand, sending it skittering across the ground. Harris staggered back, eyes wide in shock. "You really don't get it, do you?" Tommy said, his voice shaking but firm. "It's over, Harris. Your empire is done." The sheriff, now recovering from his earlier fall, pushed himself off the ground, pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt. "You're right about one thing, Harris," he said, his voice low, "but not about everything. The only one who's going to walk out of here free is you, straight into a cell." As the sheriff and Laura moved in to arrest Harris, the final pieces clicked into place. Tommy had been trying to protect himself, but in the end, he had done the right thing. He had made the decision to put an end to the corruption, even if it meant risking everything. James couldn't believe it. The very person he had suspected most was the one who had turned the tide. Tommy had risked his life to stop Harris from getting away, and now finally justice was within reach. But as Harris was being led away, still shouting about his power and influence, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something in the way Laura had acted, the way she had moved so decisively, lingered in his mind. She hadn't been as eager for Harris' capture as she seemed. There was something else, something still hidden beneath the surface. And then, as the sheriff and Laura prepared to leave, Laura turned to James, a knowing look in her eyes. "Not everything is as it seems," she said cryptically. "This is just the beginning." James' heart skipped a beat, and as the night began to settle, he realized the truth. The town might be free of Harris, but the war wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. And in the distance, he could already feel the storm building again. As the dust began to settle, James found himself standing in the middle of it all, his mind still spinning. The events of the past few hours felt like they'd been pulled from some twisted dream. Harris was in custody, Sheriff Daniels had been taken down, and O'Malley, though still alive, was heading to the hospital. There had been a battle, no doubt, but the fight wasn't over. James knew this now. The real war was just beginning. The town felt different. Maybe it was the silence, the sudden stillness that had fallen over it now that Harris was gone. Maybe it was the realization that the corruption he'd been fighting against had been deeper than he ever imagined. It wasn't just the mayor's death, or O'Malley's twisted loyalties, or even the betrayal from those he trusted. It was the system itself. The machinery of power that kept grinding on, regardless of who got caught in its gears. James turned to Tommy, who was standing by the car, looking like a man who'd just emerged from a long, dark tunnel. Tommy's voice was low as he spoke, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, man. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I could play it safe, just keep my head down, but it got out of hand. I'm glad it's over, but I'm not sure I'll ever be able to make up for what I did." He ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. James didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell Tommy that it was okay, that they would figure it out together. But the truth was that the damage had been done. They had both been caught in a system that had eaten them alive. The road to redemption wasn't simple. It wasn't just about one good decision or one moment of clarity. It was about years of choices, each one shaping who they were now. "I know," James said quietly. "But we both did what we could. That's what matters. You did the right thing in the end." Tommy gave a small, grateful nod. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel like enough." James glanced over at Laura, who had been quietly talking to the sheriff, making sure the cuffs were secure, her expression unreadable. He hadn't expected her to be involved in all of this, not after everything that had happened. But now seeing her stand there, calm and composed, he realized that she had been playing the long game all along. She had always been in it for the bigger picture, even when it meant making tough calls. She turned to him, her face softening for a brief moment, and walked over. "We got him, James," she said. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Laura sighed, glancing back at the sheriff and the two other figures who had helped in the capture. "Harris might be behind bars, but he's not the only one in charge here. We've got a long list of people who were helping him, people who think they can't be touched. And they won't go down without a fight." James' stomach twisted. He had known there were more layers to the conspiracy, but hearing it from Laura made it all the more real. This was bigger than just one corrupt mayor. There were powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests, to keep the town under their thumb. Laura continued, her voice low. "The mayor's death was just the beginning. We'll have to keep pushing, keep exposing the truth. But it won't be easy. There will be people who try to silence us. People who'll do anything to protect their secrets." James nodded slowly, his mind racing. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't walk away from this now. He had seen too much, and the people of this town needed to know the truth. The fight against corruption wasn't just about exposing one person. It was about changing the system that allowed it to thrive. "We'll do what we can," James said, his voice steady. "But we'll need more than just us. We need the people who believe in what's right. We need them to stand up." Laura gave a small smile, the first hint of warmth breaking through her hard exterior. "That's exactly what we'll do. We've already started, and the more people know, the stronger we become." As they stood there, the weight of the situation settling in, James couldn't help but feel a strange sense of resolve. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be more battles, more moments of doubt, but he wasn't alone in this. He had Tommy, Laura, and a few others who would fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The next few weeks passed in a blur of interviews, press conferences, and behind-the-scenes work as James and Laura coordinated with others who had been working on the inside, gathering evidence, and building a case. The corruption that had plagued the town for years was being exposed piece by piece. It wasn't pretty, but it was necessary, and it was working. Tommy, though still dealing with his guilt, threw himself into the work. He started making amends, reaching out to people he'd wronged, trying to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't an easy road, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. Months later, after countless investigations, arrests, and a few more close calls, things began to change. The mayor's office was restructured, and new leadership took over, with a focus on transparency and accountability. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. James stood in front of the new town hall one afternoon, watching as people filed in to vote in the new mayoral election. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope for the future. As Laura walked up beside him, she smiled faintly. "You did good, James." James looked at her, then back at the crowd. "We did good, but this is just the beginning." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The town wasn't perfect, and the work wasn't finished. But at least now there was hope that things could change, that the people could take back control of their own lives. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.